I'm very pleased to welcome you to our Ecological Continuity Trust webinar series. This is our 35th seminar. And today we're going to hear from Rodrigo Olave, who's going to talk to us about 36 years of research at the Loughgall Agroforestry long-term experiment. Dr. Olave has more than 25 years experience working in forest ecology. And his interests have always revolved around tree improvement and forest genetics. So after working as a research scientist in southern Patagonia, which I'm sure must be amazing, he took up a post in AFBI, the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute in Northern Ireland. And his work is on forest genetic resources, and he works with a range of different organisations to do that, including the Forest Genetic Resources Trust, Future Trees Trust and Farm Woodland Forum, both in the UK and in Ireland. So Rodrigo, I'll hand over to you.
I'm going to talk about this long-term experimental field trial in Loughgall in Northern Ireland. The Loughgall site is located about, say, 40 miles from Belfast. It's in the middle of the country, and the slide you have in front of you and with those pictures represent what is the Loughgall site in Northern Ireland. It's consistent in grassland, woodland and silvipastoral plots. And next one, please. And the Loughgall site was established in 1989. And as you can see there, the whole of the UK in terms of land use, you can see that the main land use in Northern Ireland is grassland. And as I said before, the Loughgall site is right in the middle of the country in a lowland, very productive agricultural land. And on an altitude of about 30 meters above sea level. The topography of the site is rolling, rumbling hills, very sort of typical lowland areas in Northern Ireland, with a soil type brown earth red limestone till, with soil depth of about 80 centimeters. The site is quite well sheltered, not very exposed, with a pH between 6.4 and 6.7. Those were measured back in 1989. So the next one, please. A little bit of experimental history of the site. Back in 1989, the main driver in the UK was to increase tree cover as well as delivering ecosystem services. If you read any sort of paper related to this experimental site back in 1989, you will see those were the main drivers at the time. So, in other words, trying to introduce tree species on farmland. And the Loughgall site at the time was part of the UK National Network Silvipastoral Experiment across the UK. This network had experimental sites all over the 4 regions in the UK, England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. All those experimental sites had similar protocols for monitoring different parameters for these different land uses. So then back in 1989, which is 36 years ago, at the time AFI was part of the Department of Agriculture in Northern Ireland. So then quite a considerable investment went into establishing a replicate trial comparing grassland, silvipastoral and woodland system in a sort of experimental setup. Next one, please. So what you can see, this image was taken in 2022. And as you can see, the landscape is pretty much as I was describing it. This is how it looks today. It's a small site of about seven hectares. And those areas on the right, you have there most of the farm facilities in terms of machinery, livestock, and pretty much close to the site. So there was very active research activities around 20 and 36 years ago. And even, for example, the farm manager of the site still lives just right beside the site. So everything was quite well coordinated in terms of activities and work on Loughgall site. Next one, please. And now a little bit more details about the experimental design. As you can see on the right, you have another image where you can see exactly the distribution of plots on this experimental site. Those plots in yellow are the experimental plots looking at grassland, and the ones in red are the silvipastoral plots randomly allocated around the experimental area. And then you see the blue plots, which are the woodland plots. And that one is divided in two. And the reason why is because at the time, 2 tree species were planted there. One was ash Fraxinus excelsior, ash, and the other one was sycamore. The sycamore, I'm not going to talk today about the sycamore because that part of the experimental research was abandoned about 15 years ago. The reason was because sycamore didn't perform as expected. So then the main experimental area now consists in ash trees, grassland, woodland, silvipastoral, using that particular species. So then before 1989, when everything was established, the whole area there was reseeded in 1988 with the conventional grass, gray grass, in 1988. And subsequently, the trees were planted in 1989. As there are plots in silvipastoral and grassland, the grazing season using mainly sheep goes between April and November. As I said, the whole area is about 7 hectares, and the plots, every single plot is about half an hectare. The tree species is ash, and planted in silvipastoral system back in 1989 at 400 trees per hectare. The woodland plots, those in blue, were planted as conventional woodland system at 2,500 trees per hectare, and all those plots or treatments were replicated 3 times. Next one, please. In terms of the parameters, variables measured over time at this local site, I'm going to start with the climate. At the beginning of the experimental site, a conventional weather station was deployed at the site to measure a number of parameters. Some of those were air temperature, soil temperature, and rainfall, as you can see there. And so over time, we've been upgrading the system there. So then the climate, the weather is very well recorded. So now we have a more sophisticated weather station recording soil moisture, photosynthetically active radiation, air temperature, soil temperature, and rainfall. So as you can imagine, a huge amount of data from 1989 to today. And what we've been doing also just to keep data in good condition and good detail is using the Ramco model, and which for doing the corrections and also observation data for bias correction and using the data in a perfect way. So that's something, an interesting information that a number of partners in the UK have been using the climatic data for different research projects and scientific studies. Next one, please. Some of the main research elements from 1989 to present are basically four: livestock graphs, the environmental aspects of the experimental site, the economics, and silviculture. And within livestock and grass, some of the components there to research are pasture interactions, animal interactions, animal welfare. For the environmental element, climate, biodiversity, soil, economics, markets, sustainability, incentives, and policy drivers. And silviculture, tree interactions, growth and yield, and also ash dieback. I am specifically including ash dieback here because back in 1989, nobody would have thought that ash would have been badly affected by a disease. In this case, ash dieback was found in the UK in 2012, and some of the plots were affected and are affected today. So we don't have time today to go to every single component of the research, but I'm going to give you a sort of a snapshot of the key ones over time. The first one is I'm going to go first with pasture interactions, then I'm going to move on to biodiversity, and then tree interactions, ash dieback, and finally some aspects of policy drivers. Next one, please. The first one is pasture interactions. You can see there are two illustrations or two graphs. One on the right that is a study conducted 2 years ago and published just recently. And on the left, you have another one, which is a modeling exercise carried out in 1986. So then I would like to say a couple of things about that study. The first one in 1986, which was sort of the beginning of this initiative on silvipastoral system across the UK, which began in 1980s, and with the publication of a tree growth and canopy sharing model, which is this one. So then at the time in 1966, those colleagues there who wrote the paper, and from the Grassland Institute in England and colleagues from Forest Research, so they needed validation from real life data and quite important collective collaboration to do this, because it was kind of a novelty, the introduction of tree species on farmland. And there were a number of assumptions on the work here, on the modeling, and some of those were, as you can see there, farmland and grassland planted with trees at 50 trees per hectare, 100 trees per hectare, and 200 trees per hectare, and grassland receiving 150 kilograms of nitrogen per year. So that was an interesting modeling exercise with a number of growth processes, key processes like intensity, grazing, respiration, and many others. In total, the model used 8 key processes to develop this simulation. But as I said, I needed validation with real life data. And on the right, you can see the study using the real data from the Loughgall site, using now a different model, which was developed by the university in England, colleagues from Cranfield University, to calibrate pasture, ash, silvopastoral yield, and between a big chunk of time over the experimental site. And then you can see if we quickly go to, say, 20 years old, and all those assumptions made in 1986. So then we can see clearly a reduction in pasture production, depending on the tree density. And when we move to 2025, using the real live data from Loughgall, those predictions were not far from the actual data collected from this site. As you can see, those trees in Loughgall, as I said, were planted at 400 trees per hectare for the silvopastoral, and 2,500 trees per hectare for woodland system. And so you can see after thinning, and at the year 20, on using the real data and modeling with this eco yield safe, you see clearly a reduction in grass production too. In 1996, it was a little bit over an overestimation, but now the model shows a quite clear declining in grass production. Although the system presents some reduction in pasture production, there are other benefits as well coming in the system over time. One of those is, for example, biodiversity. Next one, please. Biodiversity, there have been so many studies using the Loughgall site on biodiversity, fauna, above, below biodiversity from different research groups over time. So, but I will focus in just on one single example here, which is spiders. And we all know the problem with biodiversity, diversity and abundance have declined on a global scale. Basically, the reason is this simplification of agricultural systems that causing habitat loss. Why the spiders? Spiders are predators which provide ecosystem services through natural pest control. And also spiders, as you know, are highly sensitive to environmental changes and is used as a bio indicator for studying changes in habitat modifications. So then you have in front of you two studies, one conducted on the left in 2007 using the Loughgall site, where it shows quite clearly the number of spiders in the silvopastoral system is significantly higher than grassland plots and woodland plots. That is an interesting finding from this study. So then 15 years later, in 2025, also there was a more larger experimental research funded by the European Commission, where the agroforestry, the Loughgall site was incorporated in this network of long experimental sites across Europe, including woodland sites, silvopastoral sites, orchard sites, and grassland sites. So, and again, so then in terms of spiders' richness is much higher on silvopastoral system than other land uses. So this is quite interesting, and I think when we go into the evidence base and how this information is used for, say, policy and things like that, is quite important to have these long-term studies just to see exactly how they perform. Next one, please. So back again to the tree interactions using experimental data from Loughgall and the original study conducted in 1986. We see also clearly there from the modeling exercise in 1986 that there was an overestimation in terms of timber volume when the land is planted at different tree densities. If you just, for instance, we see a year 20. A year 20, the model from 1986 simulates growth or timber volume at about, say, over 50 cubic meters per hectare at 20, and then that increases depending on the tree density. And when we move to 25 years later, 36 years later or 35 years later, with this new model, the overestimation is clear using the real data and the modeling that colleagues from England developed. And again, so if you look at the year 20, the drop there in volume is because of the thinning. But and also at year 20 is interesting that in the real experimental site in Loughgall, we had now the disease of ash dieback affecting the experimental sites in a way that nobody thought a factor like that would have been involved now in the experimental research. The effect of this particular model didn't include that factor, the disease, but it also is causing changes in the ecosystem of the experimental trial. Next one, please. Talking now about the ash dieback and some of the findings. from the experimental trial? Well, ash dieback is a serious infection caused by the fungus Jimenez fraxineus. And as I said before, it was found in the UK in 2012. And when you visit the experimental site today, the majority of trees in some degree are affected by the disease. So in terms of this sexual sporulation, this one occurs on rackeses of ash leaf. So in other words, rackeses of ash leaves are the main source of infection. An experimental work funded by the Department of Agriculture in Northern Ireland and also the Department of Agriculture in the Republic of Ireland helped to investigate a number of parameters to manage the ash dieback disease. And one of those was thinning or removing infected trees, which could reduce leaf litter in the ash stands and in the ash plots, and therefore reduce the infection. An interesting finding here was that there was no significant difference in the number of rackeses between the unthinned and thin plots. There is a trend in decreasing the leaf litter, and therefore then less infection in those on those trees. But this is something. This experimental work just was carried out just for one growing season, one full year, and I think we are monitoring in subsequent years, and also. The thinning and removing trees in woodland system and also in silvopastoral system also helps to change the microclimate, and that also have an effect on the sexual sporulation of the disease. So on the other side, on the left, on the right of the slide here, this is a new project now funded by the Department of Agriculture in Northern Ireland and the Department of Agriculture in the Republic of Ireland, which we are using again the experimental side to keep monitoring the disease, the progression of the disease, and also trying to introduce and find tolerant ash trees around the country. And in this particular case, I am just showing you one example of a tolerant ash tree seedling coming from a breeding program in Denmark, which are now planted around those experimental plots and exposed to the disease pressure from mature diseased ash trees, and which now are being monitored genetically for the disease progression and the degree of tolerance. This is a project for another 4 years in which we will be working on this and using the experimental site at Loughgall. Next one, please. Finally, I would like to finish just to talk briefly on policy drivers. As you can see, there's been a lot of research since 1989 in Loughgall. Some of those findings had been used for policy in different contexts, and one of those was for support, financial support for those establishing either woodland system, silvopastoral system in agricultural land. Say, for example, in a recent study, we found that although there are schemes available in all regions in the UK, there is a big disparity in terms of establishment, payment. As you can see, in Northern Ireland, although we don't have a measure today, but the establishment payment compared to the other regions in the UK are quite low, especially compared to Scotland and England in terms of the maintenance annual payment and the maintenance period. When you compare the silvipastoral system and the woodland system, and also there are disparities in terms of the maintenance period. And those is interesting because some of the, for example, I was talking about biodiversity, ecosystem services, and I think one of the also the findings is that some of those ecosystem services, such as biodiversity, carbon sequestration, haven't been quantified to be incorporated in these schemes, which is information now available that can be used for that. And next one and final slide, please. Finally, well, thank you very much for listening. And also, I would like to acknowledge the Department of Agriculture in Northern Ireland for funding the research for many years, and also the Department of Agriculture in the Republic of Ireland for funding the research, and the European Union. The European Union has funded at least 3 large projects over the last 36 years. And finally, I would like to thank the Ecological Continuity Trust for now registering the Loughgall site as part of their long-term experimental network across the UK, and hopefully stays with the trust for many years to come. Thanks very much indeed.